One group was excluded, basically got a free pass from that tough but important message. And those are the Arab refugees from the war against the Jewish state. Now, it's important to say there was no need for the Arabs to become refugees. Some of them try to pretend today that this was necessitated by the establishment of the Jewish state. No, they actually faced a choice. They could have had another Arab state living next to a Jewish state in peace, prosperity, and no one would have been displaced.
You're talking about before the War of Independence in 48.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The United Nations, kind of following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the interim British mandate, basically caves in to Arab demands, agrees to divide the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, the Mandate area, which was supposed to be all of it for a Jewish state. They cave in to the Arab demands, to the fact that the Arabs successfully led to the closure of the gates, and therefore there were fewer Jews for the Jewish state. They cave into Arab demands and agree for the creation of another Arab states, in addition to Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, that were all created through this mandate system. All that state had to do was to live in peace next to a rump Jewish state that was kind of designated on areas where the Jews were claimed for malaria and the Negev desert. But no. And they made it clear, they declared that they're going to war because it's more important for them that the Jews not have even a rump small state than the Arabs have another state. So they go to completely unnecessary, stupid war to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state. They fail. The Jewish state is able to kind of prevent the onslaught, declare independence, and ultimately the Arab states go for a ceasefire. We can talk about the tragedy of ceasefires in the conflict. And refugees are created in this process. It's worthwhile noting that wherever the Arabs conquered land, such as the West Bank, under Jordan, or in the Gaza Strip, no Jews were left. A complete, absolute killing and ethnic cleansing of the Jews, including the Jewish quarter in the Old City. Yeah. What became the Jewish state, a lot of Arabs stayed, but a lot of Arabs remained, but many fled. Some were expelled in the course of war, entirely normal, not special. What becomes special is that the Arab refugees from this entirely unnecessary war refuse to move on and don't get the memo of moving on. A temporary agency is established for them. That, by the way, is not special. Another temporary agency was established at the same time for the Korean refugees. Yeah. And the reason there was a temporary agency is because it was understood that it's only going to take a short while to settle the refugees. And the UNHCR was focused at this time in Europe, where the big refugee issue was happening. The UNCRA, the Korean refugees, were settled, 3.1 million of them, in 3-4 years, with about a third of the budget allocated to the Arab refugees. And that's it. Look at South Korea today. It has its problems, but on the whole, a good state. It could have been the Arabs. They hijacked the temporary agency that was created for them, UNRWA, making sure that it has its own rules, a complete exemption from global standards.
Who's they? I want to pause you for a second.
Yes.
You said they hijack UNRWA, and I want to just elaborate on what you said. People talk about this and they forget the numbers. I'm just going to throw out a couple of numbers. I don't know that they're 100% accurate. They're what I know.
Yes.
End of World War II, over 35 million people are displaced. The last ones standing that are still displaced today, Palestinian refugees, that number from the 48-49 war, let's say somewhere between 400,000 to 800,000, depending on who you ask. Grosso modo, let's say big numbers. And then there's also the 67 refugees. But then after the 48 war, you have Jews that are expelled from Arab countries. They number several million Jews that are not forcibly necessarily removed immediately, but there's an Arab League decision, and many of them have to leave those countries and never come back and lose all their possessions. And then we get to what you're describing as this position where now they're perpetuated in the state of victimhood and refugee status. And I'm interested in, I say this even as out of personal interest, I always ask the question of like, whose agendas does this serve? Because it doesn't serve the Palestinians. I'll say this differently. It's never made their life any better. If your goal is to promote the quality of life of people, to reach statehood, to reach a situation where you're progressing financially, socially, even with the basic metrics of peacefulness and quality of life, they haven't gained that. It's left them in a state of victimhood, of nationless people in certain countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. It hasn't bettered their cause. It only works if you look at it from, in my perspective, from the prism of let's stick it to the Israelis. That's the only place where it works. And I'm interested to hear, so I paused you at, well, who did this? Who made a decision that leaves them in the state where they're forever in limbo, forever sort of hovering over Israel's head as a demographic threat, but also forever never have statehood or any kind of consistent solution?
Okay, so first, you're absolutely right. As a result of World War II, tens of millions of people become refugees as a result of the end of empires in the Indian subcontinent. You're talking about millions and millions of people. Ukrainians, Poles, Greeks, Turks, Hindus, Muslims, none of them, nor their descendants, are considered refugees today. They got the memo. Tough, tragic, move on. The Arab refugees, like you said, are several hundreds of thousands. The Jewish refugees from Arab countries, from Morocco to Afghanistan, about 1 million, all ethnically cleansed in the name of only anti-Zionism. Yeah. The Arab countries claim to love Jews, have nothing against Jews. The legislation in Iraq and Egypt was against Zionism. But this is a textbook playbook, which we see it happening again today in the West. People claim to only be anti-Zionist. Ultimately, no Jews are left. The agenda. The Arab refugees themselves, and supported by the Arab countries, were understood that if they would be settled, then the war against the Jewish state is over and the Jewish state gets to live. So the agenda that it served was their agenda. The Arabs themselves went to war to prevent a Jewish state from emerging. They failed. But in their minds, that was just a blip. That was not the end of the story. You know, Israel celebrates its independence and begins to count the year. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 76 years of independence. From the Arab perspective, the fact that the Jews declared independence is their business. It's a blip. Their war against the existence of a Jewish state continues. So it was their agenda. And this is why we're saying it doesn't help them. It does, because it's their agenda. The Arab refugees themselves work to hijack UNRWA. In the book, The War of Return, we show how they ensure that UNRWA will not settle a single refugees. When UNRWA still wants to settle them, they attack it. They burn down the offices. They attack the still foreign staff at this point. And it's only once they're able to hijack it completely and to make it into a Palestinian organization, which is what it is, and to ensure that the money from the West continues to flow, even when not a single refugee gets settled and they have their own rules and their own ability to register refugees without any international standards. So it's their agenda. Now, you said that it keeps them in perpetual limbo. By the way, it did improve their lives. We show in the book that as a result of UNRWA, the Arab refugees are some of the most educated in the Arab world. They get health care and social services that are even better than some of the Arab countries. But because it's a political purpose to continue the war against the Jewish state, they actually don't care that their lives are improved, because that's not the purpose. The purpose is to continue the war against the Jewish state. And in that sense, it very much serves their purpose, because lo and behold, we are 75, 76 years after the takeover and hijacking of UNRWA, and there are now 5.9 million registered refugees. By any international standard, it's important to say they are not refugees. They would not be considered refugees in any other claim, but they have been kept this way for the purpose of the continued war against the Jewish state. And that's why it's not even a double standard. It's a unique standard for the purpose of continuing the war against the Jewish state.
Yeah, I think this is what you're stating right now is where we in the West often lose track of the thought process that they hold, in the sense that we look at it as, well, what does the Western lifestyle promote? Quality of life, living according to your values, social cohesion, the success metrics that we love talking about, GDP per capita, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They don't care about any of these things. I'll tell you a funny anecdote. We do international productions, and many years back, we did a production with like a big organization out of Hong Kong. They come to Israel, Hong Kong, for people who haven't seen pictures or visited. Very crowded city. And they wanted to visit. It's a long story. We're doing a documentary project about Israel. We visit a refugee camp outside of Bethlehem. And if you've been, you know what they look like. And we get off the minivan. It's supposed to be this dangerous refugee camp. And it's private homes, gardens, brand new cars in every parking lot. And they had this assumption that it was going to be a reconciliation organization. And I warned them in advance. I was like, look, you're probably going to be negatively surprised. And we get off the van, and the guy greets them and says, welcome to, I'm not going to name the place, so-and-so refugee camp, the most crowded place on earth. And bear in mind, they're from Hong Kong. And they look around and they start laughing. They think he's joking with them. And he says, and I literally by chance, and I tend to do these things, I was reading the other day about like the most crowded places on earth. Tel Aviv is like 10 times more crowded per square kilometer than any of these refugee camps. And this Hong Kong team looks around, they're secular directors and stuff like that. And they asked me, are we missing something? Are we in the right place? And I said, no, you misunderstand. This is the machine of Palestinian propaganda. I said, what do you mean? They've been paid to call this being a refugee. And they have the education, they have the houses built, and still they'll have the sign with the school, UNRWA, and all that jazz up there. And they live in this alternative reality where they get to call it again and again this because it hovers over our head. And I look at that and I say, like, how is the world so blind to this? How are people oblivious to this fact? And I feel, and we were talking about this before we started rolling, all this war has shown is that the UN, whatever name of agency follows the letters UN, cannot be trusted. You've seen them in Lebanon, they have tunnels underneath, Hezbollah tunnels. You see them in Gaza, they have rockets underneath their facilities. How is it that the world is still oblivious to this? How are people turning a blind eye? How are countries paying for a UN agency to perpetuate, there's no other way to say it. It's terrorism and war. There's no other way to look at it.
Indeed, there's no other way to look at it. Once you understand that UNRWA is the ideological infrastructure, literally the womb, in which every Palestinian terrorist organization is born. And, over the years, a bit like you said, I would sometimes have delegations coming to from the United States, and I would explain to them that the people of Gaza, and that is before October 7th, are committed, all of them, to the ideology of no Jewish state from the river to the sea, what they call return. They continue to maintain themselves as perpetual refugees, living in neighborhoods where no one is a refugee and there's not a camp, but they're called refugee camps. And they're perpetuating all of that for the day when there's no Jewish state. So people often ask me, but don't they want a better future for their children?
Yeah.
And when a person from the West asks that, they mean what you said, going to college, getting a good education, having a good job, prosperity. And my response to them was, they do want a better future for their children. Of course they do. The better future they imagine is one where there's no Jewish state. And for that future, they are willing to sacrifice, they are willing to fight, they are willing to suffer, but it is the better future they imagine, and they're willing to do a lot for that future. But that's their goal. And UNRWA has been a critical element in this goal. It has been hijacked as this ability to basically funnel money from the West, legitimacy, the letters UN, in order to pretend that this is a worthy cause rather than the annihilationist cause that it is. Now, why do people still not see it is a question I've asked myself repeatedly, because when I started working on it, and I came from the Israeli left, believing in two states, and looking at UNRWA and the whole refugee thing and saying, learning that the Palestinians are very serious about it, and then saying, okay, but why is the West funding it? I mean, it's one thing for the Palestinians to not want a Jewish state, but why is the West funding it to billions and billions of dollars over the years and decades? And I thought, okay, I'm going to show them the facts. You know, the book, The War of Return, one of the things I'm most proud of is that even people that don't like its recommendations, dismantle UNRWA, you're not refugees, there's no right of return, they do not challenge the facts. The book is unassailable on facts. So I thought, I'm going to bring all these facts to Western capitals. And Adi Schwartz and I, my co-writer and I, have gone to every capital that funds UNRWA in Europe, Australia, US, Canada, telling them, look, and those are the facts. Look at what you're funding. And long before October 7th, we told them, you're not going to pay a price for it in Paris, Berlin, or London. Yeah. My people will pay a price for it in blood for what you're funding. And when I repeatedly saw the refusal to see, and these are facts, and to the credit of Palestinians, they don't lie. You know, next to I think the same refugee camp, non-refugee, non-camp in Beit Lechem, there was recently a big sign that said, UNRWA services are our right until return. So the Palestinians are basically telling the West, you will pay for us everything that a normal society pays for itself. You will pay for us, not until there's a Palestinian state, not until the end of the occupation, not until there's no Israel. Until there's no Israel. And that's when you're paying us. So when I see the West not seeing it, while the Palestinians are clearly saying it, and the fanatical support that UNRWA gets, I had to let a darker thought enter my mind after October 7th. And the darker thought is that it's not ignorance, it's not inertia, that somewhere in the deep recesses of the Western consciousness, there continues to be a deep ambivalence with the existence of a Jewish state. And essentially by supporting UNRWA, by supporting what I've come to call Palestinianism, the ideology of no Jewish state, they are outsourcing their ambivalence with the existence of Jewish power, a Jewish state, to the Palestinians.
Is the word you're looking for anti-Semitism? Is that what it is, sort of underlying underneath everything?
Anti-Semitism is almost too small. Because anti-Semitism ultimately is one expression of this idea. But this is something that really goes to the deepest recesses of the Western civilization attitude towards Jews, and especially towards Jews with real power. Imagined power Jews had in the Western imagination always. Real power only recently. And this kind of ambivalence with Jews actually having real power challenges something so fundamental about how the West, or at least some parts of the West, think about themselves, is that I think that they've come to outsource that to the Palestinians and they can remain supposedly clean.
I've thought a lot about this topic.
It can be explained. I'm not sure that I understand what you say with facts. There's no question that both in Western civilization and the Islamic civilization, they have a long, shall we say, fraught history with the Jews, and especially with the idea of the collective Jew.
Okay.
Both Western theology, some of it now secularized, and Islamic theology had, in different degrees, the need to see the Jews as dispossessed, weak, and stateless in order to prove the truth of their claim. Christianity in the 16th, 7th century began a different path where there's a new part that emerged of Christian restorationism and Christian Zionism. But there's still the Western Christian that we saw it in the Soviet, Russian, but we see it also in American campuses today. Even though it's secularized, it still rests on this very ancient notion that if Jews are not dispossessed, weak, or powerless, there's something wrong with that. Islam has the same thing. The reason that I don't focus just on one, but on both, is that Palestinianism has become the crux of all of it. A lot of people, when I talk about the Palestinian complete and total refusal for a Jewish state anywhere, where their words and actions are consistent for a century, where whenever they could have had their own state, but it would have to live next to a Jewish state, they always said no and went to war. They've been very clear, very consistent. But then a lot of people go and say, okay, this is Islam. And I tell them, no. By now, we're in a very different place. Palestinianism by now has brought together the worst of the Islamic thought, the worst of Western thought, the worst. In the Western thought, there are many strains, Nazi, Soviet. If you read the Hamas charter, it's about 50-50, 50% Muslim Brotherhood, 50% Nazi Germany, Soviet propaganda. Recently, someone wrote a beautiful piece claiming that Hamas are the children of the Fanonian decolonization view. So actually, Palestinianism by now, and this is also what makes it so useful and so dangerous, it actually brings the worst of Western and Islamic thought, and it only meets in one place, which is the negation of the collective Jew.
Wow, dark. That's a very dark description. So you've done this extensive body of research, and I want to encourage people at home, by the way, if they want to learn more. You've published several books on this topic, and I'll summarize everything in a sentence. However you follow the money, you find that UN organizations are used to leave the Palestinians in a state of both refugees, but also to radicalize them, to train them to violence and hatred against the Jewish people. You can open it up a line. We could talk about this for hours. There's books full of hatred and blood libels against the Jewish people. It is a machine that is all geared towards making sure these people never live at peace with the Jewish state or the Jewish people. So here's the base foundation for everything we're talking about. And now we're living in, we're filming this in April 2025. It's been a year and 5 months of war, even more, going on 6 months since the war started. And we've found, evidence on top of evidence of how evil and corrupt and broken the UN organizations are. Okay, so we set that all aside. And now I know you've been talking about what is the solution for these kind of things. And I think in everyone's head, myself included, we're looking at what's been happening in Gaza and to a certain degree with the Iranian relationship. And you say, how do you deal with people like this? How do you deal with people that now that we've learned to believe them, we realize that they're bent on only one thing, our destruction. And there is nothing else. There is no agenda that says, when we're done with the Jews, we'll build a state and we're going to focus on poetry and flowers. That doesn't exist. All of it is, the whole identity is mukawama. It's all the religious battle and resistance to the Jewish people. And that's it. Full stop. There's no second phase to that. So here we are. We're still at war with Hamas. We still have troops in Gaza Strip. What is the next step as far as you're concerned? Now that you understand, you've explained this whole mechanism, where do we go from here?
So we begin by the phrase you said, we're at war with Hamas. That was our first mistake. I'm ignoring for now all the mistakes we made that led to October 7th. Like, as I said, for years I've been saying, this is the ideology. Listen to them. As long as you give them money, I'm on record saying as long as you give them money and this is their ideology, they will use it to build tunnels to take back what they believe is exclusively theirs from the river to the sea. Which they did. Yeah. So I'm leaving behind all the mistakes before. On October 7th, the biggest mistake that was done, and that's why we're still paying for it, is to badly define the enemy. This is my biggest criticism of the Israeli leadership. I will always tell the story of President Biden coming here after October 7th. You saw that he was clearly rattled. He gave a beautiful speech, a moving speech about the evil that was unleashed on that day, which in parentheses, I think we still are very far from processing. And then he said one thing, but Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. And I remember hearing that in real time and thinking, we're going to pay dearly for this sentiment. And the Israeli leadership immediately caved in. Rather than standing firm and saying, "Dear President Biden, thank you for everything that you're doing for us, the aircraft carriers, the don't, it meant a lot. It saved us." But unfortunately, all the data, all the evidence is that Hamas represents the Palestinians. It's merely their executive arm of the idea of no Jewish state. This is why we saw so much euphoria on October 7th, not just in Gaza, in the West Bank, Palestinians and their collaborators around the world. So I, as an Israeli prime minister, will not send soldiers to a war based on a lie. And I'm not going to send soldiers to fight just Hamas, because I compare it to the American president declaring in December 1941 war against Japanese pilots. No, he went to war against Japan and against the ideology that governed Japan. So and that's what we should have said.
Explain the gap.
The gap is that Hamas is merely the executive arm of the ideology that connects all Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Columbia University. I've come to call that Palestinianism. It has 4 core tenets. From the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state, and we are therefore perpetual refugees until return. And return, if anything ever thought it was some nostalgia, October 7th is how Palestinians imagine return, this brutal invasion and desecration of Jewish life. You see it in texts going back to the 50s, 60s, even before. So this is the ideology.
So that's the correct understanding of it.
Exactly.
And you're saying the gap is that people think they can be separated.
Precisely.
That Hamas can be removed as an organization or an ideology.
Exactly.
Same way as ISIS could be removed from the people that promoted that agenda.
So, yeah, this is the idea that there is a separate Hamas and you can only go to war against Hamas and you will kill the 20, 30,000 Hamas operatives and then it's over is completely detached from the reality of the ideology. So the war should have been, but still should, be waged against Palestinianism. I say that the goal should be that Palestinianism as an ideology must die so that Jews and Arabs can finally live. Now then people ask, how? And ideologies die with destruction, ruin, and failure. People, after October 7th, a lot of people said things like, oh, what Israel is doing in Gaza will further radicalize the Palestinians. And I remember
how much more radical could you possibly be?
Precisely. That was my thought. It was like, I don't think they can get more radical. And there's this idea, which I completely reject, empirically reject, that there is trauma determinism. If you have been the subject of violence, you will always commit violence. The Jewish people are, of course, exhibit A, that there's no trauma determinism. But the idea that you will only ever behave a certain way is empirically wrong. Nazi Germany suffered a lot of violence. Imperial Japan suffered a lot of violence. And today there are pillars of world peace. Why? Because it was made clear that the violence is directed at the transformation of their societies. And they had to go through a process of defeat, unconditional surrender. This is why I said that the conflict is a tragedy of ceasefires. There's a pattern in the conflict where the Jews are never allowed to win and the Arabs are never allowed to lose or even acknowledge defeat. That's why UNRWA is so terrible, because UNRWA sits at the original sin of telling the Arabs from 1948, you didn't lose your stupid war to prevent the Jewish state.
Loss.
Exactly. Your victory is merely delayed. Keep waiting. And lo and behold, that's what they've been doing. So we need to use this moment of destruction and ruin, of course there's destruction and ruin in Gaza, to begin transformation. Because just like in your personal life, as in collective lives, moments of destruction and ruin can be moments of growth and transformation, but only if you acknowledge responsibility.
Yes.
If all you do is blame everyone else, you're never going to go through this transformation. So this should be the moment where Gaza is left in ruins, and the Palestinians are told, this is the outcome of your choice, and it was a choice, to turn Gaza into a single integrated weaponized landscape in order to destroy the Jewish state. You've made an ideological collective choice not to build for yourselves, but to destroy what the Jews have built. These are the consequences of your choice. If you want to go in any different direction, your ideology will have to change. And that's the 4 core tenets, and it means taking away all the infrastructure. You're not refugees, so you are all erased from UNRWA's records. UNRWA's dismantled, you're not refugees. There's no such thing as a right of return. You don't possess it. It doesn't exist. And you can now choose to live next to a Jewish state rather than on top of it. Now, either Gaza surrenders collectively, but I say if that's not in the cards, allow for individual surrender. Designate an area in Gaza where people who enter have essentially individually surrendered Palestinianism. They are erased from UNRWA's records as refugees. They accept that they're not refugees. There's no return. They want to live next to a Jewish state. And they go through a process of re-education that makes sure that this ideology is dead. But that's the war we need to fight. The war against Hamas is the wrong war to fight.
So you make a very interesting point. I think it's worth delaying on. People often talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as this unique creature, the unicorn that doesn't exist elsewhere. And I'll say to them, like, look, if you've studied anything about history, both recent and ancient, that's absolute nonsense. There have been countless conflicts between countries that have been resolved in the time that this conflict has existed. Most of them far more violent. Most of them much higher numbers of casualties on both sides. Most of them are as charged with political, religious, and ideological conflict. And they're all, or not all, many of them are gone from the world. Many of them were resolved, the borders were redrawn, agreements were made, and they moved on with their life. And here, there's several interesting things. One, there's a lot of foreign and external influence that perpetuates the situation. I think that's one big issue that needs to be dealt with. And the second one is with the inner talk and narrative, which is, and this is something I think worth explaining to an international audience. We talk about this within Israeli society. Look, the Arab countries that have lost to us on countless wars at this point, it's like they never admit defeat. They've never lost a war. They've lost territory. They lost tens of thousands of soldiers, but they've never lost the war. It was us who lost. They were the victorious ones. And they'll have victory museums. And then you take that and you impose that on a people group, the Palestinians, until they do what the Germans, which you were talking about, and the Japanese do, which is admit defeat, but not just defeat on a military level on the battlefield, defeat of the ideology that led to that moment. Until you're able to say, it was the way we looked at the world that led us to this moment, you'll never change the situation. You'll keep repeating it time and time again. That's where we are. We're fighting against the people. They lose. And the next day they wake up and say, we've beat you, just don't know it yet. And we look at them and we say to them, because we're talking in a different language, are you out of your mind? Your city lays in ruins. What are you talking about? You beat us. No. We humiliated you, therefore we won. And it's this, unless they're able to dramatically change that, and I don't know how to get there. I'd be interested to hear your take. How do you get to a place where the people collectively say, look, our leadership is just trash. They've led us time and time again to this. Let's get them out of here. I've only seen it. We've seen it recently. You've seen it with some of the Sunnis in Iraq speaking up boldly against the Iranians. You've seen it with the Lebanese once there was international aid that pushed out Hezbollah. Suddenly they say, look, we've seen what your ideology brings. It looks like the Gaza Strip. We don't want any of that. Take it, get lost, lose the keys. They never want to see them again. How do we get to that position with the Palestinians where they're willing to publicly say, we are wrong? And they are wrong. Clearly, evidently, they are wrong. How do we get them to a place where they change their ideology and their tune and adopt a narrative and an identity that isn't just based in hatred and destruction towards Israel? How do we find that?
So first, we need to actually understand that this is the goal. I don't know that a lot of people understand and define this as the goal.
Within Israeli society.
And broadly around the world. After World War I ended with an armistice, essentially with a ceasefire, which allowed Germany to say, hey, we didn't lose. Our victory was taken away from us. We were stabbed in the back, and then began the whole process.
By the Jews and the Bolsheviks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the Allies in World War II were determined that World War II end with it being very clear as to who lost and who won, and there's not going to be any question about who are the losers and who are the winners. And it wasn't just Nazi Germany and Japan. Every ally of those countries had to cede territory. People were expelled, reparations. It was made clear that they lost.
Up and go, no added sugar. Look for the red band.
When you say that our conflict is not unique, you're correct in that if people had used international standards of ending conflicts, it would have ended a long time ago. I would say it would not have even started. But you see the policy towards the conflict constantly incentivizes the conflict. Because, again, you're never allowing the losing side to finally come to terms with the fact that they lost, to move on, and as a result, you perpetuate this. You essentially tell Palestinians, we're seeing that even now in Gaza, that they can try to bring the Jewish state to an end, and when they fail, they get a redo. That's been the last century. Every time they failed, they got a redo. That was the message. So the message should be, we're done, there's no redos, you need to acknowledge that. So step number one is to even put it as a goal. And as I said, it took a world war going into a second world war for allies to understand that the goal has to be unconditional surrender. This has to be our goal. You know, I was recently in the EU, in Paris for a talk. And I don't know if you saw the movie Back to the Future. There's this moment when Marty begins to understand that he's in the 50s, right? He goes into the diner, he sees the paper. When I entered this discussion in Paris, I was like, am I in the 90s? Are we in the 90s? Because all they said was go back to the negotiating table, you need to dialogue, two-state solution, as if nothing has happened. So at one point, one of the people there said, how can the EU help, right? It's always this very smug question. And I was like, you know what? What would really be helpful if the EU remembered how it became the EU. You didn't become the EU by dialoguing and going back to the negotiating table. You are the peaceful EU that you are today because some ruthless leaders understood that Germany had to be completely destroyed, unconditionally surrendered, divided, occupied, and from there, you can then dialogue and build the EU. And I told them, that's what I want for my people. That's what I want for the Middle East. A complete understanding that the ideology of Palestinianism is unacceptable, has to die, and only from that, something can build. So nothing should be built in Gaza. No dollar should be given. Israel should be supported until there is surrender. And the goal should be not ceasefires. There's a reason that ceasefire was demanded on October 7th by all kinds of people protesting, because they know that ceasefires is how the Palestinians get a redo. So enough with that. There has to be defeat, surrender, and rebuilding can only take place when the ideology has died.
What do you see actually happening? I agree with everything you're saying. And yet I look at the conversation we've been having throughout my lifetime and the lifetime preceding it. We keep repeating the same conversations time and time again. The reality around us keeps changing, and yet we're using the same language. Just negotiate, the same way you're talking about this. Just negotiate, just be a pal and, come and negotiate with these people. And we look at it and we're saying, come on, let's stop being insane for a moment. We've understood who we're facing. But at the same time, we don't want to become them. We don't want to fight an endless war forever. How do we change this? I'm looking at our current leadership. I'm looking at global leaderships around us. I don't see that. I don't see anyone who's able to say, excuse me for just a minute, let's pause this ridiculous conversation we're having and, everyone in a suit shaking hands in, a ballroom somewhere in Europe, and let's have a real conversation here. I don't hear that happening. I don't hear it happening in the Arab world, and I don't hear it happening in our own government. Where do you see this, to a great degree, changing from what we're seeing today so we don't repeat the same thing, maybe not October 7th, but what we were doing before that for 20 years of the cycles of violence against the Palestinian Authority and then Hamas? How do we break the cycle?
So first of all, you're absolutely right that we're not hearing that. Oddly enough, the person that at least came closer to breaking the mold is the American president, with his plan for Gaza, which, regardless of what you think about it, at least for the first time, introduced the quaint idea of consequences. That there's actual consequences for having weaponized all of Gaza and turned it into an integrated weaponized landscape for the annihilationist purpose of destroying what another people have built.
Yeah.
That's what we need. We need much more of breaking of that mold. You're absolutely right that we might completely lose this moment. That's what I'm concerned. I'm concerned that this moment can go in one of two ways. Either finally break the mold and say the destruction in Gaza remains until the ideology dies, until there's surrender, defeat. A book that I've been using a lot to quote about Japan is called Embracing Defeat. People think of defeat as a bad thing. It's actually sometimes a good thing from which you go in a different direction. Like you said, the Arab world has not benefited from constantly pretending that it won when it actually lost. You see it stuck. There are some voices in the Arab world that are fighting the Muslim Brotherhood and the Gulf countries that want to chart a different direction. Those are the voices that we need. But when you said we don't want to fight an endless war, to the Israeli public, I say, but that's what we've been doing. Yeah. We've had a century-long war that in many ways was the result of constantly seeking shortcuts. I have a book that I'm working on that has the great title of Peace Not Now. And the argument is that every time that we try to achieve things now, and peace now, and let's just negotiate, and let's just unilaterally disengage, or those were shortcuts. Because every time we refuse to go to war against the molten lava, which is at the core of the conflict, which is this total ideology of Palestinianism, which is all about annihilation and destruction. So I say the opposite. If we stop taking the shortcuts, if we actually make our minds to go to what might seem like a long war, to begin to dismantle UNRWA and everything, all the money. We allow a lot of things to fuel and sustain Palestinianism. We need to stop doing that. There's a lot that we can do to start to dry up that swamp. And I argue that actually if we will go head-to-head directly on the core conflict, we will see the benefits of that much sooner than all the times that we tried shortcuts.
I appreciate you saying that. I think this is something we talk about quite often. The bottom line in the end is that we look at the negotiations that Israel's been doing over the years, the Oslo Accords and countless others, and it's almost as if we were having a conversation with a person that isn't present in the room. And we were negotiating as if he's a Swede who's sitting in the room across us, and what he said is truthful and he meant to do it. And I was having to explain this to my 13-year-old daughter the other day. We were in a car ride through the Jordan Valley. She was asking C territories, B territories. And for her, it was this huge surprise. It was like, listen, when I was a kid, when I was your age, we were a country that believed in peace. Like the majority of the country believed in peace and voted for peace. And we look at it in retrospect and we say, oh, it was impossible. That's not true. We were not having a truthful conversation in the sense that we knew what the metrics were. Don't educate your population to violence and hatred. Actually make the steps needed to engage in a peaceful manner. Make the economic steps that are required to build a real economy and not a terrorism economy. There are countless steps that you can make a chart of and follow that would make a difference. We choose, I think, it's exactly what you're saying, I guess. We choose the easy out. And the easy out is let's have a ceremony now and not worry about it, about what happens later. And my sense is that if we had a real conversation and looked at the people that are across the table, and they said, they've been saying their entire lifetimes, we want to kill you and your family and everything you believe in. Let's believe them for once and say, until you dispose of that belief system, we're not having this conversation. Until you dispose of it. And I guess that's correct. I thought of something. You were talking about what the EU does. And I think the answer should be in many of those cases, just don't do anything. You've been causing more harm than benefit. The Palestinians, and I think people might not know this, they've received more money as a people group than any population on earth ever, including, you think Japan, Germany received the Marshall Plan, I don't know what the number is today. They're probably 50, 60 times more per person than what they receive to rebuild entire economies. They've done nothing with it besides build terrorism. So there is a way about it. It just requires a real conversation. And I think if anything that we can take away from this conversation is what you're saying, is just be true to the facts. Look at what they're saying, believe what they're saying for once, and then follow that line of thought. And if you're a leader or a thought maker or, a researcher, just look at the facts as they are, because they're evident. They're out there and they're clear, and they've been speaking clear. We just need to choose to believe them for once. Anyway, it's a lot to take in.
Yes. Over the years, when I would tell my personal story together with the story of the conflict, people would say things like, oh, you've changed your views, you've changed your opinions, you've moved from the left to the right. I always say on all issues, social, religious, economic, I'm very much on the left. But I would also say it's not a view. It's not an opinion. I'm going to make the claim that this is empirical. I tell them, look, think of it like a scientist. We had a hypothesis, like you said, in the 80s and the 90s, that what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state, Palestinian control of territories. That was our hypothesis. It was shaped by the world of the 90s, the end of history, the first intifada. Okay, then comes the part that you mentioned that so many people like to forget or ignore or erase. We tested that hypothesis. And like good scientists, we tested it multiple times in a variety of ways. Yeah. Barack in 2000, plus Clinton, Olmert in 2008, tested the hypothesis through direct negotiations. Two different Palestinian leaders, Arafat and Abu Mazen, could have had a sovereign state, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites. They walk away and they go to war, and they suffer no internal debate and no dissenting voices. So the Palestinians all want to walk away from that. Then between them, we have a right-wing prime minister, Ariel Sharon, that says, you know what, fine. If they can't sign an agreement, we'll just give them territory. And we get out of Gaza to the last square inch. We know what they made out of that territory, which again has tremendous, beautiful potential. So we tested the hypothesis, at least for a decade, I would say even 2, 3, not even going back to 1947, 67. And all the evidence tells you that the hypothesis is wrong. So you're a good scientist, and you ask, what is the alternative hypothesis? And always in my talks, I bring the quote from Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. He goes to the British Parliament in February 47. In February 47, there's no occupation, no settlements, no blockade of Gaza, no Bibi. There was such a time. No one has been displaced. So if anyone tells you that the conflict is because of the refugees, the displacement, in February 47...
There were none.
There were none.
Yeah.
And he says His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. He calls it irreconcilable. And he goes on to say, the Jews in the land want a sovereign Jewish state. Great. And the Arabs of the land, those that will later hijack the name Palestine to be known as Palestinians, he says those Arabs... their top priority, their top goal, more important than anything, he says, to resist to the last, resistance, right? The establishment of Jewish state in any part of the land. So now we have an alternative hypothesis. The Jews want a state, the Arabs, the Palestinians want the Jews not to have a state.
Yeah, there's no middle ground.
Turns out that this hypothesis meets all the data. From when Bevin said it in February 47 to the present day. Fits all the data. So at one point, you just have to accept. It's not a view. It's not an opinion.
It's reality.
You could have different views. You could have different opinions about what to do with it. But you can't have different views and opinions about the fact that this is the conflict.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So let's summarize this. First of all, thank you for this deep conversation. I'm going to try not to get depressed.
Sorry.
But no, sometimes you just have to come to terms with the facts. And secondly, I want to encourage everyone who's watching this at home to go find you wherever books are sold to read some of this, because what you're describing in this, whatever it's been, 45-minute conversation, it's a lifetime of research on this topic. And when you go through that process, you really come out, well, as you are, clear-headed and clear in the voice about what needs to be done. And lastly, I want to thank you. I think people can easily get despaired and lose hope in promoting what's true about what happens in this part of the world. And you've done an amazing job, I think, especially during this war. If people Google your name, they'll find it everywhere that names can be found. Doing an amazing job of really spreading truth about what's been happening in this part of the world. And in the end, it doesn't matter who you care about. You can care about Jews and not care about Jews, care about the Palestinians only. In the end, the only way to get better for any of them is to do what you're saying, is to have a truthful conversation about this part of the world. So thank you, Dr. Einat Wilf.
Thank you.
A war zone in the Gaza Strip being under fire by Hamas terrorists. You don't